Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I am delighted to welcome a senior and accomplished expert in the area of climate energy finance from Sydney, Australia, Mr. Tim Buckley. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Tim is the director of the Climate Energy Finance Australasia. Climate Energy Finance, or CEF, is a think tank established in 2022 that works pro bono in the public interest of accelerating decarbonization in line with climate science. So, Tim, my first question to you, what inspired you to transition from a 17-year-long career at the Citigroup to focus on global energy transition?
Thank you. I've been out of City for more than 15 years, but I stumbled across this opportunity, this challenge, and it comes back to, I've been privileged all of my career to work with global and Australian corporate leaders. And I was an analyst at a investment bank, Macquarie Group here in Australia, before Citigroup. But from very early on, I had the privilege of talking to Australia's top corporate leaders. And I have inadvertently been given the privilege of challenging those leaders, even at a very young age. I remember being challenged by the CEO of my company to explain why I'd gone on national TV to say that one of Australia's largest companies was a house of cards and it was going to invariably fail.
Wow.
And I got called in, it was national TV on a Sunday morning. I got called into the CEO's office, first time I'd ever met him. I was only 22. And he said, I believe you're on national TV attacking one of our corporate leaders. Could you explain why you made the comment? And I went through my thinking in a few minutes and he goes, okay. And I asked him, well, why do you ask? And he goes, oh, because the CEO of that company is also the head of the Australia's Liberal National Party, the most powerful party in Australia. And he's called me up this morning and asked me to fire you. I go, oh, should I go back and pack my desk? And he said, no, we'll just never work with that company again. I back your judgment. And I say that because I was inspired by the confidence of my CEO to back a junior member of his team against a bully, a very, very powerful bully. And the conversation lasted for 15 minutes, but I've been privileged all through my life to be able to talk to very senior leaders, to challenge them about their thinking. And in the end, I had that similar conversation with the CFO of Citigroup. I highlighted that I thought Citigroup was about to go off a cliff. The CFO, for various reasons, thought I was deluded. He politely suggested I should leave the company. I did, and I fortunately sold all of my shares. And 2 years later, the company went off the cliff. The share price dropped by 99%, and he got fired. But I landed on my feet because I then was asked to come and work in an environmental organization as a strategist, evaluating and pushing back on the incumbent industry in Australia, which is a fossil fuel industry. Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels. And I was challenged to come in and have that same conversation with the most powerful industry in Australia and challenge its right to continue to exist. And 13, 15 years later, I'm still doing that. But I love the challenge of addressing huge structural challenges and challenging corporate leaders and political leaders to see whether or not they actually are working in the long-term interests of either the nation or shareholders. And most of the time, they're not. So I like that challenge.
Amazing. You know, as you were talking, I was just thinking that to have had a leader like you had, the chairman of your first Macquarie Group, if I remember the name correctly, very, very few 22-year-olds probably have the fortune to be backed so strongly. And that really must have been a game changer for you.
Absolutely, and I'll name him. His name is Tony Berg, and yeah, I was inspired by the fact he was willing to stand by his staff, as you
Yes.
say, like
Yeah,
just staggering. And Macquarie Group has gone from being a minnow when I joined it to now being one of the most powerful investment
absolutely.
banks in the world. And it's gone from strength to strength, and it's people like Tony Berg.
Yes.
But as you say, it's the backing your own team, your own staff, and believing in it. And yeah, I've had the fortune of being able
Fantastic.
to do that.
Fantastic.
So you're
Thank you for
right.
sharing this with me and my viewers and listeners. So, Tim, let's talk about climate energy finance. Tell me a little bit about what was the driving vision behind founding CEF Australasia in 2022.
Yeah, again, I actually co-founded another global, what turned out to be a global think tank. It was called the Institute of Energy. Sorry, start again. Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. We call it IEFA. I co-founded that 14 years ago. I was there for a bit over a decade. When we started, we were three people plus one assistant. And when I left 12 years later, we had 65 staff across 12 countries in the world. We had 10 staff in India. We had offices in Hong Kong, Philippines, Singapore, and Indonesia, Australia, Turkey for a little while, London. So we became a global organization. But yeah, it's a real privilege to be able to work in the not-for-profit space and to work in the public interest. And it's backed by philanthropy.
Sure.
I had the privilege when I left IEFA, I set up climate energy finance mainly because I wanted to focus very much on Australia. IEFA's board and executive was based in America, and at the end of the day, we live in the Asian century, the greater Asian century. India is obviously a key part of that. China is a huge part of that, and Australia is blessed to be in that Asian century. So I left IEFA to actually found an Australian-based, Australian-funded think tank, although we do also work on China. I scaled back and pulled back from covering India, which has been a staggering part of my journey for the last decade. But in the end, my logic was I wanted to work in Australia's national interest and be free of American influence, if you like. But also, it's worth bearing in mind for your listeners, Australia's number one trade partner is China. Militarily an ally of America, but I see a major strategic geopolitical risk, which is now in 2025 front and center of every newspaper article every day, that China and America are challenging for global supremacy. And I always thought my country was going to be the little mouse in between, which is partly why I was inspired by working on India, because I see Australia stepping back from America and saying, well, we can be friends with China, we can be friends with America, but we also need other friends like India so that we can actually avoid being stuck in the middle of two warring elephants. So part of it is that I have the privilege of working on Australia's public national interest, and our number one trade partner is China. And China also leads the world when it comes to the embracing the opportunities for decarbonization. And as I say, in all of my discussions, China leads the world in every zero emissions industry of the future. They invest enormously in innovation, in scale, in technology, and China is Australia's number one trade partner. So at the end of the day, it's in Australia's economic interest to better understand our number one partner and to collaborate with them.
Fascinating. And, when it comes to energy, there are believers and non-believers. How do you address skepticism or resistance to the energy transition within some industries or some regions?
Yeah, there are believers or non-believers. I would argue anyone whose job requires them to not accept the science of climate change is someone I'm never going to change their mind on, because by definition, they're employed by the fossil fuel industry. And at the end of the day, their jobs won't exist in 20 years' time. They can't exist for us to have a livable planet. So to some degree, I don't engage with fossil fuel executives, although I'd have to say, and I was part of why I worked so extensively on India was I had conversations with the chair of Coal India, the chairman of NTPC, and the CEO of Tata Power. All of them understood and accepted the science of climate change, and they all understood the need for transition. And so I found that really reassuring and refreshing that in my country, if you talk to the CEO of a coal company or a gas company, they absolutely do not accept or act on the climate science. Whereas Gurdeep Singh, I always remember having a chat with him 10 years ago, and he just, let's put aside, we are a coal-fired power company. We are also embracing the science, and we ended up having a really constructive conversation about the energy transformation. I don't have those conversations in Australia, and I don't see those conversations in companies like Exxon or Chevron. They are dinosaurs, and for the world to actually be livable, those companies will have to ultimately fail and go into oblivion, into history. And so I don't try and work on climate science deniers, because invariably their livelihood depends on them not accepting the science. I'm not going to change their mind. But I do find it problematic that when I talk to our political leaders, you expect leadership from politicians. You invariably don't get that, because ultimately, unfortunately, Australia might be a democracy, but they often get into power by accepting donations from vested interests, and that undermines the effectiveness of democracy. So, ultimately, I try and talk to politicians who aren't in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry. And I say that Australia is the second or third largest exporter of fossil fuels. I know what my country is, but I know for Australia to succeed, we have to accept and act on the climate science. Absolutely. And so that's why I take so much strength and confidence by looking at what China is doing and looking at what India is doing more recently, and saying, well, China leads the world in all of these industries, and China is actually going to dominate these industries in the future. It's up to Australia to embrace those opportunities, or we will be relegated to a third world country if we don't, because those industries are driven by economics, they're driven by finance, they're driven by energy security, and they're driven by the scale and the technology and the deployments that China brings to it. And I think, to me, the race is now inevitable. We are going to have a livable planet, but it's mainly thanks to China.
Absolutely. Well said. On one side, you are telling me that Australia is the second largest exporter of fossil fuels, and at the same time, I believe Australia is one of the biggest, on a per capita basis, consumer of renewable energy. I'd love to get your perspective on how do you envision Australia becoming a renewable energy integration and superpower.
Yeah, it is like all countries work in their own national interest, whether it's China, whether it's America, whether it's India or Australia, we all work in our national interest.
Correct.
And Australia is blessed. We have a very low population density. We have the best wind and solar resources in the world. We also have a huge mining industry. We're also cursed by the resources curse. We're blessed with resources, and that means we are successful despite the fact we don't do any value add of those resources we dig and ship. And that incumbency I highlighted, like we're the number one coking coal exporter in the world, we're the number one iron ore exporter in the world, but we're also the number one exporter of lithium in the world. And our trade partner, our number one trade partner, 30% of Australia's exports go to China. So as China embraces the opportunities of energy security, as China embraces the opportunity of clean air, as China embraces the opportunity to dominate industries, employment, and exports of the future, that is providing a major catalyst for transformation of the Australian economy.
Right.
And we, as you said, I mean, to me, it's a little bit trite. We are the largest installer of rooftop solar in the world per capita, that is a statement of fact, and we pat ourselves on the back regularly. But I remind most Australians all the time that what we in Australia do in a year in terms of renewable energy installs, China does every single week. What India does in a year, China does every month. And so China installed 377 gigawatts of renewable energy in just 12 months, 12 months. And so Australia did 6 gigawatts. Now, in half of that was rooftop solar, and per capita, if you divide by a small number, 27 million people, obviously India, 1.4, 1.5 billion, 1.54 billion in China, they've got a big population. So obviously per capita, we win that race, but we're not doing anywhere near as well as what China is. And it was beautiful to see India's installs grow by 50% of renewables in the last 12 months. Now, Prime Minister Modi's been talking about that for a decade. Finally, Make in India is working with energy security, energy independence, and India's embracing the opportunity as well. So I think Australia should double and then double again our renewable energy installs, and then we'll be towards being a renewable energy superpower. But we need to do that in partnership with our key trade partners. You can't do it in isolation. Unlike India, unlike China, we're a small market. And so we're an export nation. And as an export nation, we are open, and we can certainly help countries in Asia decarbonize their economy. To me, it's a massive opportunity for my country, and we need to run as fast as we can, because plenty of other countries are in that race, and Australia is a little bit complacent because we are such a big fossil fuel exporter.
Very interesting. And my next question for you, Tim, is what are some of the biggest technological innovations you believe will shape the future of energy?
It's interesting. I've been studying the global energy transformation now for 15 or so years. I've been studying finance for 35 years, and the two go hand in hand, because ultimately to rebuild the world's energy infrastructure, as the IEA, the International Energy Agency, says, we need to see the world invest 5-6 trillion US dollars every year for the next 30 years in energy. And the only way you can do that is by finance. But to me, at the start of 2025, my most bullish forecast is that the disruption that China and Korea have built in battery energy storage systems in the last 12, 24 months. Now, it's amazing how you invest for a decade and then become an overnight success. So companies like CATL and BYD and LS Energy Solutions of Korea have invested over the last decade in building up battery technology, but the scale of what they're doing, the technology innovation of what they're doing, and then the convergence of renewable energy in the power market and electric vehicles in the transport market. You've got two concurrent system disruptions, total system disruptions to the transport industry and the power industry. Batteries are the converging factor, because the big limiting factor for wind and solar is that the sun predictably goes down almost every day, and the wind is intermittent. How you actually run a whole modern energy system with intermittent energy up until now has been problematic, but I think battery energy storage systems are going to be a solution that really accelerates the deployment of zero emissions energy. It really builds energy security, because India, China, Australia, Japan can all build energy in their own economy and get off our imported fossil fuel addiction.
Right.
And I say that for Australia, like we import $30 billion a year of oil. If we go to electric vehicles, we can power those with domestic renewables. But the thing that's going to accelerate the energy disruption globally is deployment of batteries at a scale that a year or two ago no one could possibly foresee.
Right.
That, to me, is the biggest global disruption in 2025 in the energy space. It's batteries.
Amazing, amazing. And how do you see the convergence of power, transport, and industrial sectors driving decarbonization?
That's a really major topic in Australia at the moment, and it's something I've been working on, because as you use the word, Australia is a renewable energy superpower.
Okay.
One of our energy gurus, Professor Ross Garnaut, has been saying that for 40 years. We should be a renewable energy superpower. We will be. But 40 years later, China is a renewable energy superpower. India is moving to be one. We have a real problem, which is we're an island. And all of our trade is overseas by definition. Now, I'm simplifying it, but at the end of the day, how do we get our world-leading wind and solar resources up to India, to China, to Korea, and to Japan? Now, the answer is we actually, for the last 5 or 6 years, we've been talking about, well, how about we drop a subsea cable and connect up to Singapore, and then we go across to India, and we go out through the whole of ASEAN. But subsea cables for electricity, you can do it in England. They've shown how you can do it, but it is a really expensive technology, and Australia is a long way from Singapore. It's 4,000 kilometers. We then talked about the hydrogen hype and the idea that we're going to convert wind and solar into hydrogen, green hydrogen, and then we're going to ship the hydrogen. And then we realized there are no ships to actually ship hydrogen. They could exist, but they don't. And then we say, okay, we'll convert hydrogen into green ammonia and we'll ship the ammonia. You can ship ammonia anywhere around the world. We do 100 million tons a year, but a really inefficient process. So I think what Australia's grappling is how we've got unlimited land, we've got brilliant solar, we've got brilliant wind. How do we take those latent competitive advantages and get them to our key trade partners who at the moment, like Japan, Korea, and China, rely on Australia as a trusted energy supplier? Unfortunately, it's a trusted energy supplier of fossil fuels. How do we get our brilliant wind and solar? And to me, the answer is we need to actually embody the renewable energy, embody decarbonisation in our brilliant world-leading mining sector by value-adding our mineral resources before we export them. And the number one opportunity I've spent the last year working on is green iron. If you think about beyond electrification of everything, decarbonising electricity is the number one decarbonisation opportunity in the world. It's the biggest, it's the easiest, it's the most proven. It's wind, solar, batteries, pumped hydro storage, international grid connectivity, and electrify everything. But the number two opportunity in the world is the steel industry. And Australia supplies half the world's iron ore. Half. We also supply half the world's coking coal.
Wow.
So we are a massive global exporter of the inputs to the North Asian steel industry, but we zero value add. All of our iron ore is exported with zero value add. If we actually exported iron rather than iron ore, we could effectively reduce the Greater Asian emissions pool by 1 billion tons per year. That is the second largest decarbonisation opportunity in the world. We're only going to do that if our North Asian and South Asian trade partners agree to work with us. Because at the moment, all of the iron ore is transformed in China, Japan, Korea, and India, and they have the whole vertical integration. So we need to actually see a restructuring of the global steel industry, and that means trust. Because if China or Japan or India or Korea are going to actually allow Australia to do the value adding, then that means they're beholden on us. They have to trust us. So how we overcome that in a world where geopolitical risks have never been higher, we need to have a reconstitution of the world's steel industry. But if we manage to overcome that, that is 1 billion tonne per annum decarbonisation opportunity that the IEA has been saying for a decade is too hard. It can't be done. Well, I think it can be done, but it'll only be done with partnerships of Australia with China, Japan, and Korea. I think India will end up doing it themselves rather than relying on Australia. But there is a massive opportunity. So I know I've gone into a lot of detail, but the idea of Australia exporting embodied decarbonisation by value adding our iron ore into green iron and then exporting it, that is 1 billion tonne per annum decarbonisation opportunity. It's enormous, it's globally profound, and it means my country transforms from being effectively a petro state to an electro state,
Fascinating.
and we become part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Fascinating. I have time for one more question. You've told me about how Australia can drive decarbonization. My question now is, what role do you see emerging markets in accelerating global decarbonization efforts?
I think the opportunity for emerging markets has never been stronger. And in one respect, I talk about decarbonisation, but most countries, all countries, are most worried about energy security, energy independence.
Correct.
And when you think about China is the largest importer of fossil fuels in the world, India is the second largest importer of fossil fuels in the world. So it's no surprise to me, having studied India for a decade, that Prime Minister Modi embraces the opportunity of decarbonisation, not because of the Paris Agreement. India is a developing country. The Paris Agreement's all about common but differentiated responsibilities. But Prime Minister Modi is embracing it because it means energy independence for India.
Right.
I look at China and I go, why is China leading the world in wind, in solar, in batteries, in EVs, in grid, in nuclear, in hydro, in pumped hydro storage? It's leading in all of those industries because that is their opportunity to get off their imported fossil fuel addiction. Now, the beauty of, if we look at America, and I want to keep the conversation positive, America's going isolationist with their new president.
Yeah.
I think that opens up an enormously positive opportunity for China to show its global leadership, but do it through collaboration. And so my dream for 2025 is that China collaborates with Europe, with India, with Australia, with Japan, and says, let's ignore America as America goes isolationist. Let's actually collaborate. Now, you ask about the global South. China is being locked out of the American market. So China is embracing the fact that more than half the world's GDP growth is coming from emerging markets.
Right.
So over the last 1 to 2 years, we've been tracking Chinese outbound foreign direct investment by Chinese firms over the last 2 years in the clean tech sector. And we've tracked over 140 billion US dollars of investments. So let me give you an example. China has built a wind turbine factory in Brazil to supply the whole of South America with wind turbines. Ironically, they bought the factory off GE of America, who's just pulled out of the Brazilian wind market. And China's BYD is building an electric vehicle factory in Brazil. They're building one in Turkey, in Hungary, and Morocco, and in Uzbekistan, and in Malaysia, and in Indonesia, and in Thailand.
Wow.
They're building manufacturing in the global South. So I think China is playing a geopolitical strategy, and they play to win. They play the long game. But China has realized that they have the world's best technology in all these zero emissions industries. They deploy 50-60% of the world's solar every year. Domestically, they deploy 50 to 60% of the world's wind every year. They deploy 50%, 60% of the world's electric vehicles every year. But they realize they can actually do that in the global South in a win-win-win. It's a win for China. They get to leverage their best technology. It's a win for the global South because they get manufacturing, they get investments, they get to replace imports with domestic manufacturing, and they get the world's best technology. And then it's a win for the planet because we all get to live on a livable planet if the world embraces decarbonisation. So I think China is ironically embracing the Paris Agreement for geopolitical reasons related to Trump. But isn't that beautiful that China is actually going to help the global South? And they're building more factories in the Middle East, in Uzbekistan, in Thailand, in Vietnam, in the UAE. Now, not all those countries are emerging markets, but more than half of that investment is going into them. And in India, China overtook America to be India's #1 trade partner again last year. So as America goes isolationist, China's to some degree opening up and going global, and they've realized the opportunity is most in the emerging market because that's where the massive new population and demand centers are going to be. And I'm hoping it's a win-win-win, and I think so far it's looking that way. And so I'm actually very optimistic that notwithstanding what America's doing, the world's probably going to embrace more collaboration and more aspiration, and will solve the global collective problem of climate change. And China is doing what the Paris Agreement was all about, which is the developed countries, the world leading countries, helping the developing countries to skip a couple of technologies and deploy at the speed and scale and provide the financial capital to do that, and in a win-win-win way. So I'm actually very optimistic about the opportunity to actually solve the climate crisis collectively.
Thank you. And on that note, Tim, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey. The two amazing stories you told me, one from Macquarie and the second from Citigroup, was so fascinating about your own career, your journey. Thank you also for speaking to me at length about climate energy. We spoke about skepticism. We spoke about renewable energy. We spoke about some of the technological innovations. And we, of course, spoke about decarbonization. And clearly, you are a great fan of China because of the amount of knowledge you seem to have on China and the amount of times you spoke about all the great work China is doing in the world. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you very much for hosting me today. It's a privilege.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.